CART Demo 2. Select draft practices in CART to treat resource concerns. The requirements for this lesson is the user is logged into CART and has previously created an assessment and has identified resource concerns and completed the resource inventory. A list of historical practices is displayed for a land unit when the planner clicks on a land unit in the tree view. Planners will be able to add observed practices to a land unit and indicate if the historical and observed practices are still functional. After verifying the existing practices, planners will be able to add planned practices in CART, which will show up as draft practices in Conservation Desktop. Supporting practices which support the primary practices should also be added. The objectives for this lesson are: at the end of the lesson, you will be able to search for practices, sort and filter practices by type, name, and code, add observed practices to the list of existing practices on a land unit, add planned practices and supporting practices in CART, which will show up as a status of draft in Conservation Desktop. First, we will add existing practices in CART. Select Existing Practices from the Assessment Summary page. CART goes to the Existing Practices page. Select the arrows next to the track names to expand the land units beneath them. Select Track 1000 Land Unit 1 from the Tracks Land Units list. Note that land units can also be grouped and viewed by land use using the View By box. Under Existing Practices, select Historical to view historical practices, if any, on the PLU. Note that applied practices and practices that are in a planned status and are obligated will show up as historical. If a historical practice is no longer functional, select the functional checkbox next to it to mark that the practice is non-functional, in effect, no longer fulfilling its purpose of addressing a resource concern. If a practice is set to non-functional, this planner must enter a comment. For the same land unit, under Existing Practices, select Observed and then select Add Practice. The Add Practice dialog box appears. Select Code in the Sort By box. Note that existing practices can be sorted by the practice code or the practice name. In the Practice Type box, select Conservation Practices from the drop-down menu. Scroll to and select Practice 382, Fence. Select Add Selected. The practice is added to the list. Note that the following actions are available after a practice has been added to a land unit. The functional checkbox. If a practice is no longer functional meaning it is fulfilling its purpose of addressing a resource concern, select the checkbox to uncheck it. By default, all added practices are set to functional. Comments. Comments can be entered for practices. A comment is required for any practice that is set to non-functional. Delete. Select the X next to a practice to remove it from the land unit. Under Tracks Land Units, select Mark PLU Complete for Tract 1000 Land Unit 1. Note that land units can be marked complete after practices have been added to each individual land unit, or at the end after all practices have been added verified for all applicable land units. The land unit is verified as complete with a green check mark. Next, select Track 1000 Land Unit 2. Select Add Practice again under Observed Practices. The Add dialog box appears. In the Search Practices box, type Fence. CART will narrow the search results based on the information entered. Check the box for 382 Fence and select Add Selected. The practice is added to the list. Under Tracks Land Units, select Mark PLU Complete for Tract 1000 Land Unit 2. Repeat the step to add observed practices on the remaining land units. Note that multiple practices can be selected and added to the PLU at the same time. Note, if a PLU does not have any existing practices, still select the PLU and select the Mark PLU Complete button. Select Save at the bottom of the page when finished. CART displays the message Save Successfully in a dialog box. Select Close or X to exit. Click on Assessment Summary in the breadcrumbs at the top of the page to return to the Assessment Summary page. Existing Practices is marked Complete in the summary grid. The next step is adding planned practices in CART. From the Assessment Summary page, select Planned Practices on the Assessment Dashboard. The Planned Practices page is opened. Select the arrows next to the tracks to expand out the individual land units. Select Track 1000, Land Unit 1. Note that any planned practices that have been added to the land unit in Conservation Desktop should show up here in CART. Practices with an alternative status cannot be removed from the land unit in CART. To add a draft planned practice, select the Add Practice button. The Add Practice dialog box appears. In the Practice Type drop-down, select Conservation Practices. In the Search Practices box, the results will filter and narrow the more specific the search is. Type 382 in the search bar to search for Practice 382 Fence. Select the checkbox for the practice and then select Add Selected. Practice 382 is added to the list of planned practices for Tract 1000, Land Unit 1. The practice status is displayed. Draft practices can be removed from the list of planned practices by selecting the Delete button next to the practice. Select Add Practice again. In the Add Practice dialog box, search for Pond. Select Practice 378 Pond and Add Selected. Practice 378 Pond is added to the list of planned practices for Tract 1000, Land Unit 1. Repeat to add practices Brush Management 314, Prescribed Grazing 528, Nutrient Management 590, and Integrated Pest Management 595 to Tract 1000, Land Unit 1 by searching and adding each practice by its name or practice code. Select Mark Complete for Tract 1000, Land Unit 1. The PLU is marked complete and validated with a green check mark. Repeat the steps to add the additional planned practices to the remaining tract's land units. After all the practices have been added to the land units, select each land unit and click Mark PLU Complete. The practices will be validated as complete with a green check mark. Note that Mark PLU Complete can be done after practices have been added to each land unit or after all practices have been added to all land units. Click Save at the bottom of the page when finished. CART will prompt a Save Data pop-up with the message, "Are you sure you want to save your changes?" Select OK to proceed saving. CART displays a message verifying the information saved successfully. Select Close to exit. Click on Assessment Summary in the breadcrumbs at the top of the page to return to the Assessment Summary page. Planned Practices is marked complete in the Assessment dashboard.